We'll start with a short presentation by Jock Lowe, who was Concorde's longest-serving pilot. He was their chief pilot from 1989 to 91, then British Airways chief pilot until 96. He's president of the Royal Aeronautical Society and also the master of the Guild of Air Pilots and Navigators. Jock.
Okay, thank you. The microphone's working, that's a good start. Well, thank you all for coming. It's quite surprising that Heathrow should create a bit of interest. But, look, UK is a trading nation. A trading nation needs communication centres. Heathrow is the communication centre that the world envies. It's a real jewel in our crown. It's a worldwide brand. Why would you take your prize asset and not exploit it further if there is demand? If market forces were there, that's perhaps what I would say we should follow. Incidentally, neither Gatwick nor Stansted are full, so why would you put another runway there? So what's the concept? Well, I've been flying in and out of Heathrow for 40 odd years, and safety has been the main task within that flying, within my ground jobs. And when the ideas came up about the difficulty of expanding Heathrow, I thought, well, it isn't really difficult at all. The politician said no third runway and no new people in the noise envelope. Well, we can do that. All we have to do is to extend both the main runways that are about 6,400, 6,500 metres long, have a block of 600 metres in the middle-ish. It can be 700, it can be 800, bearing in mind that the mandatory requirement applied worldwide is for a safety zone of 240 metres after a runway. And in this way you can have a runway north and south where you can land and take off simultaneously. And that will give you about 1 million possible movements a year as opposed to current 500,000 in round numbers. Now, dealing initially in this little talk with noise, what we've said is you're unlikely to need 1 million movements. You're not likely to go above a requirement for 800,000 movements in the next 30, 40 years. And so by freeing up 25% of the slots, you can do some noise alternation. You can also ensure that the aeroplanes are not sort of crammed immediately one on top of another, which means that approaches that make less noise will be possible. So we can get, shall we say, 800,000 movements. We can deal with noise, and at the back there are some maps, and I'll bring up a picture here which shows that by the time this is open and the aeroplane mix that there must be around by then because of legislation, that means that the noise footprints, even with 800,000 movements, in other words more than half as many as you've got now, will be smaller than they are now. In addition to all of that, there is the ability to make it a true transport hub. It's not an airport hub, it's a major airport where there's flights come in from all over Europe, the UK, and some interconnections on long-haul flights, but it's a major airport. To make it a transport hub, we need to deal with the roads and we need to deal with railways. So on that picture there you can see the blue line to the left. That's a diverted M25, which doesn't need to go through very many houses because most of the land out there is actually reservoirs or used for gravel extraction. If you want to solve the M25 problem around Heathrow, you probably need 5 lanes or 6 lanes, but that'll have to happen anyway. And then the final link is that to the north of the airport, the railway lines go. Great Western Crossrail will go, and we could even put in a high-speed link if there was a desire. So I'll move that on, and you can see to the north of the Green Line's representing the current train lines or planned train lines, there's a great big space where you can put a station. If you want competition for Heathrow, you can make it a terminal which will be separately run, or you can make it a terminal run by Heathrow, or you don't even have to have a terminal there at all, you just have a station and interlinks, good interlinks into the terminal area. If you would put a terminal 6 or 7 in the airport, there will be enough space. So we can deal with aeroplanes, road transport to a large extent, although even more will need to be done, whatever plan comes out for Heathrow, and we can do trains. And the benefit of all this is that we do it for a fraction of the price of any of the other ideas. We need for the southern runway a little bit of Stanwell Moor, and for the top runway a little bit of a business park in Colnbrook. But it doesn't destroy any of the villages which the Heathrow options will do. For instance, they're north of the airport options take out Harmondsworth, Sipson and perhaps Longford. If it's to the south, it takes out Stanwell Moor and much of Stanwell. So in summary, we think we can do this expansion of Heathrow with all the slots that you'll need, and connect it to the railway, and change the motorway for about £12 billion, which is cheaper than, as I say, than all the other, better value. I shouldn't use the word cheap, better value. And at the same time, with some noise alternation, landing in the morning, the aeroplanes can land on the second part of the runway when you've got no departures, so they take another 2.5 miles out of flights over Hounslow and over the east of London. So there's not too many disadvantages if we want to keep that jewel of Heathrow expanding. The only criticisms I read are some fairly superficial ones from Heathrow Airport themselves. They mention safety. If you believe what they've put, it means that every airport in the world is currently unsafe. And a lot of the runways, which have only got 240 metres at the end of the runway, there's then a sea or a cliff or a railway line. So I would have thought 600 metres was a reasonable safety factor on top of that. And we can make it longer if you want. And in terms of train connections and connecting into the ground transport system, these are concepts. This isn't the final plan. There will be an awful lot of work that can be done to make it so that it genuinely competes in terms of facilities with the continental airports like Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Paris, but at the same time retains its preeminent spot in the world's transport networks. So that's my 5 minutes. I'll happily answer any questions afterwards.
Yeah, we'll take questions after all speakers, I dare say. Alistair Heath is next. Alistair, of course, is editor of City AM, which is having a great booming success, a circulation of around 130,000. And obviously he has his weekly column in the Daily Telegraph as well, which is now very much a must-read. Alistair.
Thank you. I mean, it seems to me that the UK has failed catastrophically when it comes to its airport policy, not just in the last few years, but over the last few decades. And I think that failure is a major problem for us. In a modern world, airport capacity has replaced shipping in many ways when it comes to tapping into some very high growth kinds of economic activity, for example, tourism from China, a lot of kind of modern freight, and a lot of these transactions involving people and business people and so on, which the UK desperately needs if it is to maintain and grow its prosperity over the next few years. So I think clearly we're failing massively. We are, we've just come out, I've just been listening to George Osborne, and he once again reiterated the government support for HS2, which would cost a very, very large amount of money, but will take a very, very long time to build, but will not have the kinds of advantages and benefits that increasing airport capacity in London and the South East would have. And I think we've got form when it comes to being useless at sorting out airports. I mean, I was reading up on the history of what happened over the last few decades, and we were having exactly the same debate, it seems, in the 1960s. It took about 10 years, and by the early 1970s, the government finally decided it was going to build a massive new airport in Maplin Sands in Foulness on the Thames Estuary. And the whole thing was given the go-ahead in 1972, 1973. It got planning permission, it got the royal assent, and it was an incredible scheme. It involved building a massive new airport, it involved building 2 new motorways into London called the M12 and the M13. It involved building a new town of 600,000 people, and it involved building a new shipping and container port and so on to sort out all that at the same time. And then, of course, the Labour Party cancelled the whole project quite quickly. And we've never really recovered since. And not just when it comes to airport capacity, but also when it comes to housing, to be honest, and to a lot of other things. So basically then everything dragged on and dragged on and dragged on, and then we almost got a Heathrow expansion, and then the government cancelled that, and now we are where we are. And when you compare the situation in this country to what's happening in emerging markets, in those markets that are trying to jump on growth, I mean, we've got a major problem. Take Dubai, for example. I mean, obviously, you can't compare a country like Dubai and a country like the UK, but nonetheless, one can learn lessons from how ambitious these sorts of countries, how ambitious their plans are, and how they understand the need for airport capacity, how they understand that in a modern world, having airports is actually a very, very important, vital path to economic growth and to be linked in to global trade flows. So if you go to Dubai, they've already got an airport which is very, very nice, works very well, and is almost as big as Heathrow. Yet, they've just been building a new airport, a second one called Dubai World Central, and that one's starting to open for passengers in October. It's already open for freight, and eventually will have capacity for 120 to 140 million people a year and be the largest airport in the world. If you go to Turkey, same thing. They too are building an airport which they claim is going to be the biggest airport in the world. These countries are taking action. If you look at what's happening in Europe, same thing. And when you talk to business people, when you talk to anyone who's interested in London and the UK's future, they all talk about airport capacity. They all realise there's a major problem. They all can tell you in sight and at length how few routes we have directly from London to the different Chinese cities. And then you look at what's happening in the EU, in the Eurozone, and they are, of course, doing the opposite. They are building all these routes. And we're really, really falling behind on all of that. So what is the answer? To be honest with you, we're really, really stuck. I really like this plan. I think this plan is a very, very exciting plan. And you know, I'm not an expert in the science of it, but it seems to me like something that could work really well. The problem is, politically, I just feel that Heathrow is just not going to happen. You've got Boris Johnson is completely and utterly opposed to expanding Heathrow. I can't see him ever changing his mind on that. And you know, who knows what will happen after 2015, after the general election and so on. So I find it very difficult to see how Heathrow will, in practice, be expanded. Which means that we may still have to either expand one of the other airports, but as a previous speaker said, even though these airports are actually not the airport that everyone wants to go to, and there still remains the option of building a completely new airport. We're basically stuck politically. There's no simple solution. It's one of those cases where the losses incurred by a few people are having a disproportionate effect on the entire course of the economy. So I'm slightly negative about our prospects and all of that. But it is quite clear that modern trade and modern tourism has to rely on much larger amounts of airport capacity. If you're looking for the kinds of economic activities that can create large numbers of jobs, not just among highly skilled people, you have to see that tourism is a major avenue for growth. Tourism is one of those things that the UK could really do very, very well. That could, we could easily triple or quadruple, even multiply by 10 the number of people coming to the UK from India, from China and so on. You could have tens of millions of people almost coming every year if we could cope with it. You could build thousands of new hotels which you'd fill. It could become a major source of revenues. It could employ hundreds of thousands of people who are not especially skilled, for example. And these are the sorts of things we need to be doing. Unfortunately, we can't with the current airport capacity. It's just not going to happen. So we're just going to lose all this market, lose all this prosperity, lose all these revenues, and just fall further and further behind. So I just very much hope that either we go for a plan like this, or someone decides to build a completely new airport, or someone decides something very, very quickly. As far as I'm concerned, we need a lot more airport capacity very, very soon, and that's the most important thing, rather than exactly where it eventually goes to.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is Graeme Leach, who is the Chief Economist and Director of Policy at the Institute of Directors. Graeme.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're not very good, are we, at infrastructure decisions in the UK. We're paralysed by inaction on Heathrow, and yet we're leaping forward to spending at least 50 billion on HS2. And as I said last week, it's cheaper to knock down Birmingham and rebuild it 20 minutes closer to London and make more sense than that. That's not official IOD policy. So slightly contentious remark to make at the Conservative Party conference. But if Gordon Brown had won the 2010 election, we'd have had a decision on Heathrow by now, because there was the Infrastructure Planning Commission, which had a statutory obligation to just make a decision within 12 months on a strategic national project. And there can be fewer strategic national projects than Heathrow. I mean, it is the bellwether, it is surely the signal, the statement to the world about where Britain wants to be in the 21st century in terms of competitiveness. And we are paralysed by inaction. And you can see it across the whole economic debate, and it's really, really frustrating, where everything focuses on the demand side of the economy, debates about austerity and how we can boost demand, when the fundamental question is the flip side of that. It's what should we be doing policy-wise to maximise the competitiveness of the UK economy in the long term? What can we do to drive up the competitiveness of the UK economy? Business clearly wants a decision. There is a frustration with business. There is just this despair as well that activity is hopping over the pond into Europe, into Schiphol, Charles de Gaulle, Frankfurt, other airports which are taking activity away from London, quite simply because London is the hub, Heathrow is the hub, but there aren't the slots there. So many emerging markets you cannot fly direct to from Heathrow. And it's just ridiculous in the modern world. If we want to be competitive, we have to address this issue. Now, clearly there have been lots of suggested projects here. We've had Boris Island. Those of you who are aware of the Norman Foster Partnership scheme as well, which looks fantastic. You look at the presentation on that, it's little boys in a toy shop stuff. It's all your Scalextric and Hornby train sets rolled up into one with superb graphics. It's wonderful. You get all excited, maglev trains into London, whoa! And then of course you realise this thing's going to cost 70 or 80 billion quid. It's not going to happen, because you're just simply not going to get the scale of activity moving. I live in Reading, Thames Valley. Half the economic activity in the Thames Valley is there because of Heathrow. Microsoft, Google, Oracle, all these companies, they're there because of Heathrow. And moving everything to the far side of Kent ain't going to work in that perspective. It's hugely expensive, the Boris Island or the Foster. I know Boris has now sort of collapsed his ideas into Foster partnerships and proposals. But it's hugely expensive. I think what Jock's shown here today is something which is really, really exciting. Because everybody looks at the Heathrow problem and they think, how are you going to do it? You can't afford to do it somewhere else, it's just too expensive. And the scale of sunk investment in West London, in the Thames Valley, is such that it was just absolutely gigantic pressures and economic pressures against it. And you look at Heathrow, and you've obviously got all the sunk investment there, new terminal buildings, new one about to open, and you want to do something at Heathrow, and then you think, how can you do it? Because actually you don't need... We're debating a third runway at Heathrow, but actually we should be debating the fourth runway, because in 20 years' time we'll need a fourth one. And then suddenly this pops up, and it actually begins to tick the boxes. Like Allister, I'm not technically qualified to judge on this, but I do like the economics of it. I like the cost of it compared with the grander schemes, and more particularly the implication of that cost for user charges on the airlines and passengers as a result as well, which makes the UK competitive not just in terms of capacity potentially, but also in terms of cost. And let's not forget that we have nasty habit at the moment of hitting the aviation sector on all sides. We're hitting them with a pincer movement, lack of capacity at Heathrow and air passenger duty at the same time. So this really helps. It addresses costs. It's something that can be done by the private sector without the public sector. Yippee, that means it will happen. And really, most of all, it's the speed factor. This can be done within a relatively short period of time. It would transform expectations. It would transform the attitudes of airline companies towards Heathrow as well. They do not want to move away. They want to be at Heathrow. They want more capacity at Heathrow. They want that hub capacity there. They don't buy into the point-to-point arguments. Yes, we want more point-to-point capacity eventually, but that's not going to be dealt with out of Heathrow. The idea that you can use Birmingham or Gatwick as some other hub, pie in the sky in my opinion. Some would disagree, I know. There's somebody from Birmingham or Gatwick here, no doubt they will do in the Q&A in a second. But essentially, I think you have to focus on Heathrow, and this thing could work potentially, in my view, really speed up and transform the economics of it and the engineering and the physical building and construction aspect to it. Of course, the one hiccup here is Alistair's point, the Mayor of London and marginal seats in West London. But somehow, I actually think, looking at this, that common sense could yet prevail. So thank you, Jock and the CPS.
Thank you, Graeme. Our final speaker is Steve Baker, who is MP for Wickham, first elected in 2010. He was a member of the Transport Select Committee, but is now chair of the 1922 Committee on Public Policy, which does include transport. He was, some time ago, an engineer officer in the Royal Air Force, so he does know something about airplanes, and has worked internationally on this subject. Steve.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. And ladies and gentlemen, before I go any further, I would just like to thank Tim and the CPS for all the work they're doing with us in Parliament on policy. They're incredibly helpful and useful and thoughtful. Undoubtedly one of the preeminent think tanks in London.
You can come back.
And I would encourage you to join them. I would only say, the only reason I'm not saying the preeminent is I don't want you to upset the IEA. But no, they do a fantastic job. There is a vast amount to be said about this subject. That's volume 1 of the Transport Committee's Aviation Strategy Report. Volumes 2 and 3 are available online. So a huge amount to be said. I'll just try and pick out some of the headlines. I'm very aware that there's a huge clash of interests over this. Who isn't? And I very much look forward to the questions afterwards to see what you say. It's an absurdity, really, that we're still wringing our hands over this subject, just as both of our economist friends have said. It's absurd that it's so politicised. It's absurd that we don't seem to be making too much forward progress when it's so important. But let's talk then about the politics. My constituency of Wickham, in its southern area, is affected by Heathrow noise. I occasionally do receive complaints from people in Marlow Bottom, and I've stood in about noise, and I've stood in Medmenham watching the jets come through about every couple of minutes. Some whisper past, and some are actually a bit of a nuisance. Noise affects my constituency, so it's with some trepidation that I sit here today to say that I think that Heathrow should be expanded. Now, what I would say to people is that when you call for political courage, it's very easy to call for political courage when your name's not on the ballot paper. Now, that's not just because when your name's on the ballot paper you're trying to get elected, but I tell you, it does focus the mind when you're the one receiving the complaints. It is necessary to have some political courage on this, but what I would say is that any plan that goes forward doesn't just need to make sure it affects nobody additionally, it needs to make sure it improves people's quality of life, and in two particular ways. Firstly, in relation to noise, and secondly, in relation to getting cars off the road as it expands. And I think actually that this Heathrow hub solution that's been brought forward, it seems that potentially it could do both of those things. And in doing those things, reducing the noise impact and improving transport links, it seems to me that it could actually break the political deadlock. So I'm encouraged to be here today. In terms of the Transport Committee, I'll just run through about 5 key points. The committee concluded that the current situation is clearly unsustainable, that a third runway is long overdue and that a fourth might be viable. Secondly, that aviation should be allowed to grow and that there should be a single hub in the UK. Thirdly, then, that there should be no new hub. We concluded that it wasn't viable commercially, that it would require a vast subsidy, and that closing Heathrow to make it work would have a vast economic impact. I have to say, on this point, we should not wonder why it is we keep getting poorer if we keep using the power to tax in order to subsidise projects which are loss-making. The cost of the subsidy required to build that estuary airport was estimated at about 28 billion. But we can't keep doing this, using taxation to do things which are loss-making. If we wish to be better off, we must divert scarce resources into profit-making projects. And again, wringing our hands and saying we're still relying on Victorian infrastructure, I just remind you all that although people may have lost their shirts in the Victorian era, that was private profit-making investment in infrastructure, or at least they sought to make profit. And if we wish to have a boom in infrastructure, not only in Heathrow but elsewhere, we really must find ways to enable private investors to invest profitably. And if we don't do that, we shouldn't be surprised that we are becoming poorer. So the subject drives me absolutely insane. We should not have a split hub, and I enjoyed listening to Michael O'Leary because he was radically free market, but I christened his suggestion the O'Leary triple. He suggested we should have privately funded expansion at Heathrow, Gatwick and Stansted. Sounds wonderful, but actually bottom line is no split hub because it would be uncompetitive. And I'm sorry because I know I've seen friends who had a very good link proposal, but no split hub. So that then leaves us with Heathrow expansion being absolutely necessary. The questions are how to expand it, how to deliver a national noise compensation scheme which works, how to integrate public transport, and what to do about air passenger duty. That was broadly the set of the scope of what came out of the Transport Committee report, which I very much agreed with. So then, where does that leave us? When I look at this Heathrow hub, it seems to me that the question is why not? I can't, for the life of me, see a reason why not to do it. In fact, the one thing I saw as I read through their own more detailed proposal than this one, in fact this document, the only problem I could immediately spot is what to do about threshold markings, because the lengths of the runways change depending whether you're operating east or west, but I feel sure that Jock will be able to tell us later. But yes, why not this proposal? Incremental, privately funded, quick. I mean, it could be up within 5 years. You could have significant new runway capacity within 5 years, whereas Heathrow's own proposal would require until 2025. It seems to me, on the face of it, a no-brainer. I can't be absolutely unequivocal in my support because I haven't looked at the full range of proposals. But Heathrow should expand. This seems to me an excellent way of doing it, and I certainly congratulate everybody who has brought it forwards.
Thank you, Steve. Before taking questions from the floor, which we are very much looking forward to, I'd just like to ask Jock to just one question. Given that this is a far cheaper proposal, why are Heathrow Airport themselves not in favour?
I don't know. I think I've talked to some of them and just tried to discuss it a little. I think perhaps they just didn't think of it.
Pride is a terrible thing.
Perhaps you can ask him. But we've talked to the chairman, and he certainly seemed to like the idea, and we've asked some very sensible and positive questions about it. So there's no reason that and this is runway capacity primarily, and then ground transport and trains. There's no reason that elements of the schemes can't be combined. I mean, they've got strong views on the rail connections and on where you put stations and so on. There is a debate to be had. They clearly won't like a terminal to the north with a station because that will be competition. So I would look after my own house if I was them too. But I've not found any sustainable arguments from them against it. And of course, the real benefit of this scheme is it doesn't involve knocking down villages. The north runway at Heathrow, it takes out Simpson, Harmondsworth, probably Longford. Well, you know what the fuss was when they tried to do the third runway. The south runway takes out the whole of Stanwell Moor instead of just a little bit that we propose, and really makes Stanwell pretty uninhabitable. so I look forward to some further discussions with them, and clearly there is ability to combine the two schemes.
And do say where you're from.
Yeah, it's John Morris from Birmingham Airport. So I will be making a crusade to tell your members of the Midlands exactly what you think of Birmingham. So thank you for that.
That was a joke, John.
Do you not think?
Humour bypass.
Yes, but people like you quote things and get quoted and repeated. So I'm sorry, it's just not on. So anyway, the main question is: do you not think that when you're talking about London and having an airport for London, do you not think, particularly when you're in a great city such as Manchester as we are today, there's a huge irony in the fact that actually you should be talking about connectivity to Manchester as well? And a lot of people in this room will actually think there's been a huge arrogance display this morning because you're conflating the needs of London with the needs of the rest of the UK. And I think that this gets repeated time after time after time. We have stories such as the airlines don't want to go anywhere else. Well, actually they do, because Manchester's been very successful, Birmingham's been successful. British Airways might not want to move out of London, but that's their problem. So I think, great, do what you need to do for London, but do not conflate the needs of the South East with the rest of the United Kingdom. And you know, we might get somewhere then with connecting markets, and certainly the next election is going to be fought in the Midlands and in the North. It won't just be fought in the South East. And people won't forget these generalities.
Well, if I may, I mean, I'd be absolutely delighted if Manchester economically started to outstrip London. I'm always pleased to be here. I consider myself a Manchester Liberal. That's why I'm in the Conservative Party. That's the absurdity of politics today. I consider myself a Manchester Liberal in the style of Cobden and Brighton. I believe that if this region rediscovered those principles of political economy which made it great, which created all these wonderful buildings that we have around us, and it breaks my heart to see all those empty, broken down factories, if this region would rediscover those principles of freedom that made it great, then it could outstrip London, because London's too cramped, too crowded, too dependent on finance, and I would dearly love to see Manchester succeed, and Birmingham too. How are we going to do it? Well, I believe the answer is freedom and competition and driving forwards. I'm afraid, though, the fact is that Heathrow is where it is. It is our hub. I don't think we should conflate, certainly we shouldn't, I'm from Cornwall originally, I mean, of course I'm in Buckinghamshire now, but we shouldn't conflate London's interests with the rest of the country's. I desperately want to see a second industrial revolution in the north of England. But Heathrow's where it is, it ought to expand, and we ought to be figuring out how to make sure the north of England succeeds too, rather than seeing it as either or. I don't believe it is.
Thank you.
I mean, if I could just, I think at the Roskill report in the early 70s, they actually recommended Birmingham, perhaps not your current site, but somewhere south, instead of Coblington or place in the middle of Buckinghamshire or what else, and then put the whole transport infrastructure, roads, railways and so on, particularly from London, because that is where there's 10 million people, then that would probably be the answer. I just think now the time, that opportunity's passed, and there's such investment in the Heathrow southeast area, and in 2.5 hours drive or train, there's more than half the population of the UK can get there. Birmingham deals with the northern bit, but I think it was a pity it was lost 40 years ago, but I think that time was gone.
But a lot of people in this room weren't born when Roskill came out, so the point I'm making is this is a bigger issue than aviation. It's about the economy of the country, and we have to look very carefully at what we really need, not what airlines or airports want.
Right.
Well, I think none of this discussion about Heathrow, capacity Heathrow, precludes an expansion of point-to-point capacity elsewhere. And if you're talking about the future of the economy, we need to think about it. Well, we've got two choices there. We either do planning, and we do long-range forward planning, and you can do that, or you just do the obvious thing, you take the signal the market is giving you. The market is telling you there is 99% capacity at Heathrow. The market is signalling a need for very significant additional capacity at Heathrow. Therefore, we have to address that. And to argue that somehow that capacity issue can be addressed by creating new mini hubs elsewhere, I don't believe it can. Now, we differ on that. You know, good men can differ. So don't get aggressive on me. I know you
I don't get aggressive. Would you therefore, just if I may indulge in just one thing, would you therefore agree that there should be a completely free market at Heathrow and there should be no price capping? That everyone should find a market rate in terms of how much airlines are charging?
Anybody who knows my views on free markets knows the answer to that one. So.
Yeah.
Thank you. Gentleman standing in the back.
Thank you. My name is Brian Ross. I'm Suffolk in the constituency, and I'm also here representing Airport Watch, which is a body that represents communities who live around all the airports. And I thought Steve made a very good point about the sort of economic realism or the market realism, that there isn't a market really for perhaps more than one new airport in the southeast over the next 20 or 30 years. My issue really is that in 20 months' time, Sir Howard Davis is going to publish a shortlist. He says that up to 7 options might be on the shortlist. As soon as the shortlist is published, people are going to be blighted, communities are going to be blighted in West London, around Gatwick, Stansted, Birmingham, all over the place. And I think it's important, I don't know what influence can be brought to bear, is first of all to ensure that the shortlist is as small and as realistic as possible. And secondly, to ensure that the people who are proposing those schemes introduce some form of safety net to protect the people during the period until a final decision is made. Protect people from harm. I don't know what, or Steve, I don't know whether the Transport Committee has got a view on this, but I think it's quite important issues, because there's going to be a long period of uncertainty.
I mean, if I can just give the first part of the answer, is that this scheme doesn't bring any new people into the noise footprint. In fact, over time, by the time it's open, in fact, it will reduce it. So if it was a short list of 1, we could avoid all the light. But on the second point, I think it's for the politicians to answer that one, and I think it is an issue.
Alistair?
I just think that brings us to something really interesting, which is how do you compensate losers when it comes to airport expansion? And to be honest, how do you compensate losers when it comes to the planning system in general? I think that's one of the major failures of the British planning system, which is that there's clearly a number of projects that would be economically beneficial, but all these projects have a number, generally quite a small number, of big losers. So I think we need to change, and we need to be much more prepared to buy off, to massively compensate the losers. Let's say you have a new airport and it costs an extra £1 billion, say, or a new runway or something like that. Let's say it costs another £1 billion just to literally buy hundreds of houses or thousands of houses and just above market price, or just give cash compensation to people. That's what should happen. Even if it's £2 billion, that we should be much more prepared to buy off losers, to create effectively, as much as possible, a market in losses as well as a market in gains. And that's the big, that in general, a version of this needs to be applied to all kinds of planning, which is that planning ought to be a way of arbitrating between the winners and the losers, rather than stopping the winners from existing and only focusing on the losers. But the losers are very important, and I can understand why losers are not happy. But I think that, so we need a completely new approach, I think. And if we had that, yes, it would temporarily increase some costs, but it would be massively cheaper than doing nothing, or massively cheaper than delaying everything by years and years and years and years. And you could replace, the other thing that's crazy is all these endless delays where, you investigate whether you want to do this, and another 6 months, another year, another 6 months, another year, and so on. You just need to have a system to compensate losers. I think that's the most important thing.
I very much agree with what Alistair's saying, not for the first time. There's a publication from the IEA called Liberating the Land that talks about how compensation might work in a reform planning system, and I would certainly recommend it. But Brian, I think you're absolutely right about blight. HS2 does not go through my constituency. I've opposed it anyway. But where it is scheduled to run, yes, blight is a disaster for people, a heartbreaking one. And it certainly needs to be dealt with. But I think the key thing here is to get to a short list, as you suggest, and to have a decision made quickly rather than it dragging on. But I personally, again, I would come back to one of the reasons I'm attracted to this proposal, as I said earlier, is I think it could break the political deadlock by reducing noise and improving transport links. It remains, I mean, as I say, I haven't looked at all of them. But if this proposal can actually reduce the impact on people, then I would have rather hoped that could be confirmed and a decision made quickly, in which case hopefully blight would be minimised.
Thank you. Lots of questions. The gentleman with the glasses.
Yes, Stuart Lilly, I'm from Oxfordshire County Council, and we have a dilemma at the moment because we have one of Mr Cameron's enterprise zones called Science Vale Oxford, which is one of the fastest and most rapid growing scientific research establishments in the country. We have the synchrotron, we have the Cullum Lab, we have people in space exploration and satellite construction. But we have a problem, namely Birmingham is a bit too far and doesn't do the flights to the right places. Heathrow does, but we do not have good communications to it. So we have a double dilemma. We have Formula One, 80% of which comes from Oxfordshire. We've got a tremendous brain power and a wonderful economic future. But already we have seen some of our scientific people disappear to other countries purely because we are not making any decisions on air travel. It's as though the town and country planning system has gone to bed and won't wake up. And this question over the airport just goes on and on and on. And I feel it's going to be very serious, not only for the economy of my county, but also most of the counties, unless a decision is made very rapidly. Thank you.
Gentleman here.
Graeme Naughty, Conservative Transport Group. I live in Derby, and I'm going to be a bit of a devil's advocate here. My last 4 business trips to visit customers to whom I export British-made goods, of those, 3 have been from Heathrow and 1 from Birmingham. Now, if I'm forced to go from Derby to Heathrow, to go on my business flights, can you honestly justifiably say that Heathrow is overcrowded? Can I have a good answer to that one, please?
Overcrowded now.
You know, what I'm saying is, if I need to come from Derby, rather than go to Birmingham for a flight to Moscow or Hong Kong, is that a case of saying that Heathrow is not overcrowded? It's a bit of a devil's advocate one for you.
Well, Heathrow is overcrowded because it's at 99% capacity, so there isn't a debate about whether Heathrow is overcrowded. It's a fact. Now, the issue I think you're dealing with a separate issue. You're asking whether you have to go all the way to Heathrow. So ideally, we'd want more capacity out of Birmingham, which will please this gentleman. So I think they're separate issues really. You're talking about point-to-point capacity out of Birmingham versus the fact that you've got a maximal burst in the gunnels at Heathrow.
I mean, I don't think you can get direct to Hong Kong from Birmingham, can you?
You can't, but I think what the gentleman here is
No, I don't
saying...
think they're right.
What the gentleman here is saying, that you say it's what the market wants to do, it's clearly not what the customer wants to do, it's what the airlines want to do is use Heathrow. The customers want to use the airport that's most convenient.
Well, it depends where you will get a competitive flight to operate.
Absolutely.
There's not enough.
Absolutely.
It would seem enough demand for direct, because the aeroplanes won't take off and do that distance, will they?
Yes, they will from April, yes.
From not at the moment.
From April.
So, okay. Manchester as well. So it's just that there's a greater frequency of flights, and that's the point we're actually making. But Heathrow, you've got a choice.
A couple of questions here, and lady first.
Jane Johnston from NATS, that's Air Traffic Control. You mentioned all the main elements of national infrastructure except for airspace in your presentation as a pilot. I know that you appreciate the importance of airspace probably more than anybody else in the room, but what consideration have you given to the airspace requirements?
Well, it's actually quite a significant issue. I didn't want to go into it. The bonus of this scheme is that you've actually got just 2 approach paths and the current departure paths. So you don't need to restructure the entire airspace, which all the other systems, be it the Gatwick, Stansted, Birmingham, all would require major reconstruction of the of the airspace. This one doesn't, because from 2018, that when the LAMP initiative comes into play, the holding patterns go, the phasing is done further out, and so they just come into the same patterns that they do now. I would actually suggest that NATS could talk to their controllers about why they actually spread out their aeroplanes on this extended trombone and go over Marlow Bottom and Medmenham, because there's no need for it. No need at all.
Just get that on the video.
But in terms of major change, and certainly from the people I've talked to, it's the simplest, by far the simplest scheme for NATS. Running 3 runways in Heathrow, or 4, is, I have to say, a nightmare. And the airports that do it around the world have that nightmare situation. So if you want simplicity for you, for your people, this is it.
Yeah, Simon Bohr, I'm from Heathrow Airport. So I thought I should just comment on a proposal that we're only in favour of things we've come up with ourselves, partly because our own proposals to the Commission are actually not based on our own ideas, they're based on a paper that was put forward by Tim Lunig and Policy Exchange Centre Forum last year, which suggested that by moving runways to the west you could have less noise over London. And we're not opposed to the ideas that are being put forward today either. We think they're quite exciting, they're quite interesting, and I think what they show is that there are innovative new ideas out there for how you can deliver the capacity that the country desperately needs, but without some of the environmental impacts that previous proposals have. We've got some areas where we think the proposals are a little bit more optimistic than our own assessment, both in terms of cost and in terms of some of the noise impacts, but really it's for the Airports Commission to look at all of the evidence and then to weigh up the pros and cons of each and make the decision as to what's in the best interest of the country. But I think this is a proposal that does show that we can expand Heathrow in a way that is more sensitive to some of the environmental concerns than the previous proposal.
Good, thank you.
Gentleman right at the back.
Hi, Rory Meakin, Taxpayers Alliance. I think the biggest obstacle is obviously politics for such a range of schemes, whether it's this one, the Policy Exchange, Centre Forum one, Heathrow's own proposals. They're obviously, they can be funded privately, they will help get the growth back that we're so desperately needing in this country. So what can we do? What likelihood is there of actually getting some political acceptance through from Boris Johnson or his successor and from the Prime Minister, or possibly his successor too?
I suppose I'd better...
That's still...
Did I mention I'm only a humble engineer? Rory, I would say that one of the most important things the Taxpayers Alliance could do to help all this along is to oppose the wasteful use of taxpayers' money on loss-making schemes, in personal view. The Boris Island proposal also is desperately bad in terms of air traffic, I understand. So I would encourage the Taxpayers Alliance really to keep doing what it does and oppose wasted taxpayers' money. I think I just will, since this is Conservative conference, I'll just make a political point. I'm in the Conservative Party because I think the Conservative Party is the best party to govern this country. We do need to govern this country when that means having a Conservative majority. And it is a fact that we have to win some seats around Heathrow. And that, yes, you're right, there's politics involved. Well, yes, of course. But that, it is not only because of concern for politics that people suggest common sense things like reducing the noise. We do actually genuinely in politics sometimes, I know it's hard to believe, but we do sometimes genuinely in politics wish to improve the quality of people's lives. So I think it is possible to get political traction, but it requires the proposal that's brought forward and adopted to have a clearly positive impact on people's lives without making us all poorer by wasting taxpayers' money. So I hope that's helpful. I certainly think that the Taxpayers Alliance has an important role to play in opposing Boris's madcap scheme.
And if the Wilson Review comes up with a clear recommendation in 2 years' time, do you think it would be politically possible to go ahead? quickly with whatever they recommend?
I think it'd be politically possible if it's clear that that proposal actually improves people's lives. And as I think I've said several times, I really do think it's extremely important that a proposal to expand Heathrow should be shown to actually make things better for people affected by noise. And until I'd studied this proposal, I didn't think it was going to be possible to say that. But I think I can say it because studying this proposal shows me that it's possible. So, you know, I do think it's politically possible, but it will require deftness and a degree of sincerity to actually carry it through.
Just two very quick points. I mean, one of the sort of ironies of all this, of course, is that the better the economy is doing, the more intense the capacity constraints are at Heathrow. Actually, ironically, probably the less likely we get action because the economy is doing okay and everybody said, oh, the long-term damage to the economy for not doing something is, you know, not quite as significant. So you almost, I'm not arguing for this, but you almost want a situation where the economy isn't doing well and people are desperate to find some ways of finding growth, and that's a pretty obvious one. But I think related to whatever the Commission comes up with in terms of recommendations, let's say they came up with this, which would be great. Let's say they go through all the detail and say this is the best option. There is still Alistair's issue, I think, to be addressed, and that is how do we compensate the losers more effectively, and how do we turn it into, instead of a win-lose, into a big win and a slightly smaller win.
I mean, it seems to me that's actually the key point here. To me, the biggest problem is, I find this plan very exciting, far more interesting than a lot of the other plans I've seen. But, bottom line is this, Boris Johnson is totally opposed to Heathrow expansion. Boris Johnson is Mayor of London. For the moment, who knows if there's going to be a third term, second term, who knows, he's the most successful Conservative politician. He's a man that the opinion polls show, could win an outright majority if one day in the future he's leader of the party and so on and so forth. Yet, he's completely and utterly opposed to this. So how do you reconcile those two things, especially given that this is a Conservative Party conference? There's a really big problem here. So, one part of the solution may be to come up with a plan like this and to also have a loss compensation plan, which is so good. So let's say the thing's going to cost 12 billion under your plans. Let's say it were to cost 14 billion, and there's £2 billion of loss compensation measures thrown in. That might be enough to sway the debate completely. I think ultimately it's going to boil down to that. And 14 billion is still better than, let's say for sake argument, anything between 50 and 100 billion for a new airport plus all the losses in the Thames Valley and Russell stuff. It's all about paying people off. We're okay spending tens of billions of... Well, when it comes to HS2, we're okay spending some crazy amount of money on this scheme. And yet we don't want to spend £1 billion, say, on compensating losers. That's just a completely wrong way of proceeding. Now, I was talking about Dubai before, and Dubai is obviously a desert, and they can just build a new airport in the desert, so they don't have these loss compensation problems. But we just need to have loss compensation mechanisms.
I think all that. The problem is our attitude is more akin to Detroit than Dubai.
I think we'll take the last question here. Yes.
Jonathan Council from Sustainable Aviation. You mentioned that the up to 800,000 movements, no new people affected by noise and shrinking noise tonsils. Are you able to share some details of that?
Yeah, there's a map at the back. It's based. Well, there's a tiny number of people affected to the west, but with the noise profiles of the aircraft that must be introduced from 2020 onwards, and by the time this is finished and going up to the capacity, you're looking so far ahead that the mix of aeroplanes will include a large number of them. So you'll be able to see it on the map at the back, but the dotted lines are the profiles at the moment, 57, 60 decibel limits. The solid lines are the new ones. In addition to that, my own belief, and I speak now as a part, there are other things we can do. We can do steeper intermediate approaches, which is to get the aeroplane more quietly down to, say, 5 or 6 miles. We can certainly do curved approaches. Emirates already do it in Dubai, where they don't need it. So you can find the least populated areas. So I think that we can justify the comment that by the time this is functioning at the 800,000, the noise footprints will be smaller, and there is the high expectation that we can do even more with operating techniques. Partly that requires Jane and her people in NATS to help accommodate it, but it's not pie in the sky, it's in operation. Even City Airport does 5.5 degree slopes. I'm not suggesting that, by the way, in case there's any, but to do 5 degrees, say down to 2,000 feet or 1,800 feet, where all the noise goes above the aircraft rather than down, would halve. It takes a huge number of people out of the footprints. So, possible, well, definitely happen with this model, could be even better.
Thank you very much. Just before closing, I'd like to give another advertisement for the CPS. We have another fantastic lineup this evening on the economy at Manchester Town Hall with Andrew Towery, Dr. Gerard Lyons, Boris's economic advisor, and Fraser Nelson. But I'd like to thank you all for coming along today, but also, of course, to thank our panellists, Jock, Graeme, Steve, and Allister. And just to point out that the date for the first shortlist of the Davis Review is on the 17th of December. So I hope you'll join me in wishing Jock the very best of luck for making that list. Thank you very much indeed.